I'm Tom Morello, and you're listening to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. My name is Steve Scrovan, along with my co-host David Feldman. Hello, David.
Hello, we've got a great show.
Indeed, we do. And one of the things that makes it great is the man of the hour, Ralph Nader. Hello, Ralph.
Hello, everybody.
We're going to start today's show with our continuing analysis of the Ukraine crisis. Our first guest will be Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson. He joined us last September to walk us through the United States' illegal war in Afghanistan, our war crimes, corruption, and disastrous withdrawal. Rather than enjoying peace for the first time in 20 years, are we about to spend trillions of dollars on another criminal war? Events are moving quickly as we record this, but we'll ask Colonel Wilkerson to shed some light. Our second guest will be Howard University professor Clarence Lusane. For more than 4 decades, Professor Lusane has studied human rights, anti-racism, politics, and Black social movements. He has consulted on Capitol Hill, and as a scholar, researcher, policy advocate, and activist, he has traveled to over 70 nations. In his new book, $20 and Change, Professor Lusane examines something closer to home, the $20 bill. We'll ask him about his book, the campaign to replace Andrew Jackson with Harriett Tubman on our currency, and what that ongoing debate reveals about America's relationship to race and history. Then, if we have time, Ralph will answer a listener question. As always, somewhere in the middle, we'll check in with our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber. But first, as the news about the situation in Ukraine changes minute to minute, what are the more long-standing principles that can be applied to resolving this conflict? David?
Lawrence Wilkerson is a retired U.S. Army colonel, distinguished adjunct professor of government and public policy at the College of William and Mary, and former chief of staff to Secretary of State Colin Powell. Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson.
Thank you. Good to be with you.
Yes, welcome indeed, Larry. We're going to start with the Ukraine because our listeners have heard some of our guests talk about Ukraine. They have some familiarity. I always point out that the western frontier of Russia has been invaded 3 major times by Napoleon and by the Kaiser in World War I and by Hitler, with tens of millions of fatalities, casualties, and destruction. I think the casualty toll in the siege of Leningrad itself was 750,000 people, which compares with what the U.S. lost in World War II of some 450,000 people in both the Pacific and European theaters. So the suffering of Russians from their western frontier can frame something of what's going on here in the dispute regarding Ukraine. Ukraine was, as we all know, part of the Soviet Union until the Soviet Union broke up. And the memories of the Russian people are very deep here about security on the western frontier, which is why Putin can feel comfortable in doing what he's been doing. So give us your take, Larry, about both this so-called dispute and the U.S. government's response along with NATO so far.
I'd go back even further than you, Ralph. I wrote a poem about it once when I was in university, when Prince Nevsky defeated the Huns and others, mercenaries mostly, on Lake Peipus, when the ice broke on the lake and swallowed all the opposition. So Russia has been fearful of those borders for many, many years. And Ukraine has been, since, as I recall, Catherine the Great, a part of, quote, Russia, unquote. Indeed, today, some of his most important tank foundries and also artillery cannon foundries are in Ukraine. The Ukrainians today probably regret the decision, but there was no real fight over it at all when Russia, then the USSR, decided under Gorbachev to let us begin to help them destroy their nuclear weapons and to indeed come down from the some 30,000 weapons they had. Ukraine, of course, having many of those weapons, turned them back over to Mother Moscow with no real argument about it. Today, they would probably say, well, that's something we shouldn't have done. But that's one leadership in Kiev that might say that. Perhaps Ukrainians in general wouldn't say that. It's a long history, and I certainly understand. I don't support Putin. I don't think Putin is a very good leader. I don't think his way of wiping out his opposition is particularly savory, but I do understand his strategic grasp, and I do understand the fact that his military leaders are very frightened by the creep of NATO. I shouldn't say the creep, the onslaught of NATO. Indeed, my president, George W. Bush, went to Tbilisi and, standing by the Georgian president, declared Georgia would be a member of NATO in the future. What a colossally stupid thing to do. And yet we did it. And we've been doing it ever since, largely so Lockheed Martin and others could sell their wares to more and more countries in the world. And I don't blame Putin for what he has done in standing up to our expansion of NATO.
Yeah, this was a military alliance formed after World War II, directed at the Soviet Union. And it was in Western Europe and the U.S. And after the fall of the Soviet Union, contrary to, as you say, assurances from the U.S. during the unification of Germany, which Russia agreed to and didn't try
Ralph,
to dispute.
Those assurances were powerful. I just had a debate, literally, with one of my old friends over Jim Baker supposedly having come back and recanted and said that no, when he got back to Washington, the assurances that coal had been given in Germany and Shevardnadze and Gorbachev had been given in Moscow were not acceptable to George H.W. Bush. Well, my man, Colin Powell, my boss at the time, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, due to Goldwater Nichols, attended all the NSC meetings. He was the principal by Goldwater Nichols, the change to the 1947 National Security Act, the penultimate amendment. He was the principal advisor, the principal military advisor to the president, the NSC, and the Secretary of Defense. So he went to the meetings, and he never came back and told me anything about that. And he debriefed me on all the meetings. So as far as I was concerned, Powell's euphoria, he was ecstatic even about what was happening, that Russia was possibly going to be an observer at NATO and maybe even eventually a member of NATO. And where did we go astray in that history? Where do we go from that halcyon time when the Cold War was over and H.W. Bush, to his inestimable credit, did not want to beat his chest, did not want to trumpet, did not want to, claim victory and so forth, just wanted to get on with the, as he called it, the New World Order, a peaceful world order. What happened to all of that? What happened to all that happiness and joy, if you will, at the end of the Cold War and the prospect of peace? Well, Bill Clinton largely happened to it when in 1994 he decided that he needed some more foreign policy bona fides. And oh, by the way, he needed some more contributions from people like Lockheed Martin and Raytheon and Grumman and so forth, and more bona fides in the national security field. So he began a very rapid expansion of NATO with no consideration whatsoever for what the other side, in this case Russia, might think.
Larry, exactly what's the nature of the expansion? They put out feelers to Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, asking them to join. What was the nature of the expansion? And was there a quid pro quo where they had to buy F-16s and other U.S. weapons?
It was always considered to be a progress that would go slowly and over time. I remember Bill Perry, one of Bill Clinton's secretaries of defense, telling me as I visited him with my Marine Corps Wally seminar, and he'd just come back from Moscow. He'd just come back for several days in Moscow. And he was as euphoric as Powell had been before about what was happening. There was a plan that we would march very slowly with all the former Warsaw Pact countries considering not just NATO membership, but EU membership. And that plan would unfold very, very slowly, methodically, and it would unfold only as they came to be able to meet the requirements of both EU and NATO. And by the way, NATO's were more rigorous than the EU's. And it would unfold only as Russia said, okay, that's good, okay, that's good, okay, that's good. And we all nodded our heads in accordance with that initial agreement. What happened was that I was just on a webinar with the Quincy Institute on this very thing. You had the CEOs and other people working for these now global, they're not just US, they're global arms manufacturers and arms merchants. You had them insinuating themselves into their equivalents, incipient though they were, within these new countries. And they become embedded with one another. And then you start getting, I need this, I need that, and you make this, and you make that. And so very soon you have the kind of relationship we have with Saudi Arabia today, where you don't know the difference between the Saudi side and the U.S. side because they're linked. They're joined at the hip, and they share in the profits, and they share in the ventures, and they share in the weapons building and the weapons use. We've done this all over the world, and we were salivating at the prospect because some of the lines, the cruise missile line, for example, the F-16 line, for example, they were going into low-rate production, or they were going coal, like the tank line recently did, and the Congress stepped in and we made tanks that are now stored up in the mountains that we'll never use, but that cost the American taxpayer a huge amount of money. So these industries all work together to build the kind of need, quote unquote, and Ukraine is a perfect example of that today. Not for nothing did the New York Times report on some of the CEOs actually talking in meetings about how their shareholders and potential stock buyers ought to pay attention to Ukraine because Lockheed and Raytheon and all the rest of these guys, their stocks were just going to skyrocket because of what was happening in Ukraine. This is a war industry. And what happened in 1994 and the years following was the war industry got a hold of the process of NATO expansion, along with other interests. And it was Katie bar the door. Let's go. Let's go right up to the steps of Moscow if we want to.
How prescient Eisenhower was when he coined the phrase military-industrial complex. Originally, I understand in the speech where he referred to it.
Military, industrial, congressional, university, think tank, research, you name it. They are everywhere now. They're all over my campus at William & Mary now. They're all over my campus with new proposals, new money. It's very hard for these schools to turn this money down, especially a public university like William & Mary.
Let's go right to the current situation. If you were Joe Biden and Secretary of State Blinken, what would you be doing about this Ukraine situation?
First thing I'd do is walk into the closet and say, please, God, if I believed in God, I'd say, please, God, give me some imagination and give me some diplomatic skill. I'd do that before I did anything else because we're totally devoid of diplomatic skill. And we have no imagination at all. And with imagination goes something called empathy. That is to say, the ability to put yourself in the other fellow's shoes or the other woman's shoes and see it the way they see it. We can't do that. Blinken and Sullivan are such amateurs against someone like Sergei Lavrov, the Soviet foreign minister, or the Russian foreign minister, who is one of the best diplomats I've ever met, maybe equaled only on the global stage right now by Wang Yi, the counselor for and foreign minister for Xi Jinping in China. So we're up against some pretty formidable foes, and we're playing amateurs. They need to start thinking, and they are, thank God. I hope I've been debriefed carefully yesterday about what they can concede under the table if they need to. The best diplomacy is conducted under the table, not in the Klieg lights. And what they concede is exactly what has got Putin's military leaders so concerned, so fearful. And that is ballistic missile defense launchers, which can double as Tomahawk missile with nuclear warhead launchers and other things like that, that they fear. They see them creeping into places like Poland, maybe into the Baltics, and they fear they're going to get even closer and reduce their warning time and reduce such things as their ability to respond to an attack. And people say, I've had these debates ongoing for the past 6 months. Well, why are they fearful of NATO attacking them? Come on, put yourself in their shoes. Wait until you see a Chinese battle fleet steaming in the Gulf of Mexico, 12 miles and 1 inch off Corpus Christi, Texas. Wait until you see that. It is China's every right under international law to do that. They could do that 24/7, all year long. What do you think Washington would say about that? Well, reverse the situation and put yourself in Putin's shoes. We are the most arrogant empire, I think, that's been around for at least a couple hundred years. And that includes the British, so that's arrogant.
Let's reverse the question here. What do you think Putin would settle for?
I think he's let it be known what he'd settle for, and I think that's what we're working on now. And that is, as I said, the most dangerous weaponry not being in Ukraine, and a tacit understanding that Ukraine won't be a member of NATO, not in the foreseeable future anyway. It's kind of like when Colin worked out the deal with his chief, actually Chen Shi-chen in China, when our EP-3 went down on Hainan Island, and it had 24 sailors aboard, as I recall, and they captured them, and they captured the plane and some very delicate equipment. And we were in a crisis mode. This was April 2001. And Powell took over immediately. He didn't even let Rumsfeld or Cheney or even the president get in it. He took over immediately. He solved the situation. And what we did, in essence, was we apologized in English in America, and the Chinese apologized in Chinese in China. And that's all that happened. And that's diplomacy. We essentially said, okay, you were in error. And the other side said, no, you were in error. Well, I accept that you were in error. I accept that I was in error. You know, you do that and you agree to it, and then the crisis is over. Well, I think that's the way it's going to be handled with regard to Ukraine and the future in NATO. Everyone will know that it's been settled that way, but neither capital is going to crow about it. Now, I worry about us, though, because unlike H.W. Bush, as I told you at the beginning of the end of the Cold War, not wanting to beat his chest over it and everything, not wanting to stand over his enemy and hoot and holler about how he'd beaten him, we tend to be that way more and more these days. So, and Joe Biden has a particular proclivity for that sort of thing, especially when his polls are slipping. So I hope that domestic politics, and the Republicans, of course, make it impossible for Biden to be this diplomatic.
Well, it seems there's a very clear path to settling this in Ukraine. One is Ukraine is not part of NATO, and NATO itself admits that it will be many years before Ukraine meets the criteria to join NATO. So Ukraine becomes a neutral area, like Austria was given neutrality after World War II. And the U.S. and NATO pulled back on the missile launchers, which have no business being that close to the Russian border. So when that's settled, we can look back and say maybe what Biden was doing, playing tough, is a message to China and Taiwan. You think so?
That might be the case, and that might be the way they're looking at it. I don't think that's the right approach to China either. That's another story altogether. And I do think that Taiwan and China, South China Sea, and all that's associated with China and a possible war with her is more serious than this business with Russia. Not least because Russia is basically losing population. It has less population than Pakistan. Russia's economy is essentially characterized, as one person in Russia put it to me yesterday, as a gas station with a capital city. So Russia's not the formidable opponent that China is. China has surpassed us in economic power, certainly in purchasing power parity, and in industrial output has surpassed us majorly, and is rapidly, if not already, surpassing us in many areas of high technology, unlike we say all the time. So China presents us with a much more formidable foe than Russia, and is therefore a much more dangerous situation. But at the end of the day, is again, yesterday in another webinar we talked about, why is everyone concerned about all these cruise missiles and other armaments on their borders and so forth, when those submarines are cruising out there with enough nuclear weaponry to destroy us all in about, maybe 24 hours? And that's the real thing we ought to be talking about. And I'm hearing hints that these talks with regard to Ukraine and NATO expansion in general and so forth with Russia are going to lead to a much more serious discussion of nuclear armaments, because there, other than the climate crisis, is the most serious threat confronting the human race.
You believe that'll be the silver lining coming out of
I certainly hope
on
so.
Ukraine?
I certainly hope so, because we have just unraveled. We have unraveled arms control, starting with George Bush and the ABM Treaty, moving on to the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, onto the Open Skies Treaty, and almost the New START. We almost let that go too. Donald Trump almost let that go. We need desperately to get back to a good, solid, manageable arms control regime. And we need to drag kicking and screaming, if necessary, countries like Israel and North Korea into that regime.
Well, who do you think is going to make the call from the United States for that kind of global embrace of serious arms control treaties, bringing up to date, bringing in more countries, and enforcing the Non-Proliferation Act, which is now not enforced.
Well, it has
Who's
to go
going to make
slowly
the call in the U.S.?
It has to go slowly and methodically. It can't go, oh, everybody tomorrow morning we're going to do this. The first step I would take is to bring China in a serious way before they start acting on what is a gestating decision right now to build far more nuclear weapons so they can ride out a first strike, changing Mao's philosophy of we only need as many as necessary to deter. They only have a couple of 300 right now. They could build 10,000 overnight virtually. They have such a powerful economy. But your question is who's going to do it? And my answer is I'm looking at the midterms. Republicans are going to take both houses of Congress. I'm looking at 2024. We may have another coup or we may have an insurrection, depending on who wins, who loses. I don't see the United States leading it. So my answer is to you, I'm very pessimistic about anyone in the West leading this necessary move to get nuclear weapons under control once again.
What interest does China have in taking the lead? They like to be number one. Why don't they take the lead?
Well, that's a good question. And if you put it to Xi Jinping and you had a decent conversation about it with him, I'm not so sure it wouldn't be productive. I don't think the Chinese, having been very close to their central party school, now 3 or 4 times, and listening to their strategic palaver, if you will, I don't think the Chinese like nuclear weapons very much the way the Iranians don't like nuclear weapons very much, if you read their fatwas. It's religious with them, but with the Chinese, it's a matter of 5,000 years of civilization, and you might say a little more astute look at things like nuclear weapons than America is capable of. And so we need to take advantage of that. And we need to sit down and we need to talk seriously, all of us, eventually, all of the nuclear weapon states, and talk seriously about how we save the human race from this scourge. Looking at what's coming after that, or what's already here, it's here. 28 February, the UN group is going to release the report on climate change, and it's going to blow some people's socks off. We are way behind. We are terribly behind. If we get to 1.5 degree rise, which we are inevitably going to, it is going to be a different way of life for every human being on this planet. If we get to 2, we're going to lose a lot of human beings on this planet. So this is a huge crisis that we need cooperation to tackle, not this antagonistic approach to international relations we're seeing demonstrated right now with regard to Ukraine.
Let's ask you for a short-term prediction. How do you think in the next 2 months the Ukraine situation is going to be resolved?
Well, I think it will resolve itself in what we were just talking about. It might be a little nasty and a little messy because Ukraine is one of the most corrupt governments and government structures in the world, and that's saying something. But it'll resolve itself in a, what I've called for now 6 years, a studied neutrality for Ukraine. And that neutrality may have features as some of those that were in some of the agreements that have been achieved already. It might have a sort of autonomy in one particular part of it. Maybe it'll have a different arrangement in Kiev in terms of Russian influence, U.S. influence, European influence in general. But it'll be a neutral country, and there'll be a dying down of the talk about it being a member of NATO, maybe even an elimination of that talk after a few years. And things will go on, and we'll have probably more brouhaha over the Baltics, or look at what's happening in the Balkans right now. The Serbs are getting restive again, looking at Bosnia-Herzegovina with jealous eyes again. They've already pretty much occupied the northern part on the other side of the river of Kosovo. So, the Balkans are always a place to watch. Here's something that happened the other day that I think is a very prescient remark. It was this Russian journalist, Fyodor Luknov. And he said, this Ukraine crisis and the other little crises surrounding it just might be a mark of the third change of Euro-Atlantic security since 1940. And he started talking about the Paris Accord and the Helsinki Final Act. And The Helsinki Final Act, I remember people poo-pooing it when it occurred, saying, especially Republicans, this doesn't mean much. It's not about real power. So, well, that's part of what empowered Gorbachev to implement glasnost and perestroika. And it brought down the Soviet Union. So the Helsinki Final Act was more formidable than people predicted at the time. Well, Lukyanov said, we need something like that today. He didn't say this, but I thought this afterwards. What I'd make the three fundamental precepts, knowing that they weren't going to be accomplishable 100%, just like Helsinki, but I'd make the three fundamental precepts of a new accord something like this. One, the U.S. denounces any desire further in the future to dominate Western Europe, economically, commercially, militarily, and so forth. Second, Moscow gives up the dream of resurrecting the Soviet Union's domination of Eastern Europe. And three, and extremely important, the now 750 million Europeans get their political act together, Brexit notwithstanding, and form something that makes sense politically and otherwise. Now, that's the most difficult one, and just my citing of the Balkans and the recent rumblings there is a case in point. But Europe needs to get its act together. Been trying to ever since the end of the Cold War, but they've been unable to do so. Had a conversation with a Danish newspaperman yesterday telling me about how alarmed he was that his country, his leaders, were kowtowing to Washington over Ukraine. And I said, you have a right to be that way, to feel that way. You need to stop doing that. All of you need to stop doing that. And you need to stand up and do the things that you can do if you are roughly unified and you apply your muscle to the task. Look at Germany, look at France, look at all the power that you have in the combination that you geographically possess. Almost 750 million people now. I know you got problems, you got basket cases like Albania and so forth, but you should be able to generate enough power to make a balancing mechanism between the duo on the right, China and Russia, and the single power on the left, the United States, especially since the United States power is receding majorly every day. Let's get something going here, and then let's get what we get going pointed at the two disasters on the horizon, nuclear weapons and climate.
We're speaking with retired Colonel Larry Wilkerson, major peace advocate, arms control advocate, with many years of experience in the U.S. government. Larry, tell us about the veterans groups like Veterans for Peace or Iraq Veterans Against War. How effective are they? And to what degree do you work with the Friends Committee and the traditional peace groups?
I've really been impressed with some of the veterans groups and what they're doing. There are a lot of vets in America who are very concerned with what they call endless stupid wars. And what they understand they did in their roles in some of these endless stupid wars. I think one of the reasons we have such a high post-traumatic stress quotient and such a high degree, unprecedented degree of suicides in the armed forces is in part produced by the fact that in three tours in Iraq or Afghanistan or wherever, they did some things that they wouldn't have been proud of even if they had done them for peace, freedom, liberty, and America. And now they realize they didn't do them for any of those things. They did them for the military-industrial complex. They did them for George W. Bush and his reelection or whatever. And that's very traumatic with them. It causes some second, third, and fourth level thoughts that often lead to suicide, I think. But many of them have taken to the hustings, as you suggested, and either politically or in some other way helping veterans are doing some pretty powerful work across the country. Vote Vets is one of the organizations that I would single out for that. They back candidates who basically are restraint, using Quincy's terms, restraint politicians. They are more for diplomacy and peace than they are for bombs, bullets, bayonets, war, and making the empire great again. So I'm very heartened by what's happening with them. I'm very disheartened by what I'm seeing with regard to what we call Christian nationalism in the ranks. I think Christian nationalism had a lot to do with the 6th January insurrection. And I'm seeing it across the board in all the services with regard to a very vivid example, vaccinations, where we had thousands in each of the services who refused to get vaccinations, many alleging religious grounds and so forth. And we even have the Secretary of Defense now having said and has started in some of the services throwing these people out of the service. Now, the Congress came in, of course, and said they had to get honorable discharges. And when you think about why that's the case, it's very worrisome. They have to get honorable discharges because the military services are having such a hard time recruiting under the all-volunteer force concept that they're afraid these people will go home to places like West Virginia, Oklahoma, Alabama, Mississippi, and pollute the ground. They'll badmouth the services, and so they'll pollute the ground, and they won't be able to recruit in what are their richest recruiting areas. But this is a very worrisome feature of Christian nationalism in this country right now, what it's doing to the armed forces, and generally speaking, what it means across America when you have some of them turning into people like those who marched on the Capitol on 6th January. But basically, veterans, I think, are doing a lot of positive things in the country, politically, helping their fellow veterans and so forth. We are not treating them all that well. I learned the other day that the number of homeless veterans is just skyrocketed. I said the suicides are off the charts. We have veterans without work as well as veterans without homes. In the Tidewater area alone in Virginia, I'm told there are some 40,000 homeless veterans. It's a mixed bag, it's a mixed picture, but I'm very happy with what some of them are doing to try and militate against this business of forever wars, endless wars, stupid wars.
And they speak with credibility because they've been over there and they've been deceived. Even in 2005, 2 years after invasion of Iraq, there was a professional poll that the Pentagon allowed of U.S. soldiers, including Marines in Iraq, and over 70% said they wanted the U.S. to get out of Iraq. That was in 2005. Let's go to Steve and David.
Yeah, very quickly, Colonel Wilkerson, because I know you're on a tight schedule and our next guest has actually arrived. I wanted to know, do we even need NATO at all?
No. As a matter of fact, in 1989, Powell turned to me at Fort McPherson in Atlanta, Georgia, and he said, when Cole goes and Mitterrand goes and all the other European leaders who don't have their feet in World War II, the transatlantic link is gone and NATO will go with it. And I said, well, maybe it should, since it was formed primarily to combat communism and the Soviet Union, and they're gone. And he smiled and said, yeah, maybe you're right. What have we done in order to change that equation? We have put it into out-of-area operations, Afghanistan, Syria, Libya. NATO led the action in Libya. How does that square with Article 5, the most important part of NATO? An attack on one is an attack on all. That's the distinguishing feature of NATO. We have adulterated that. We've murdered it. We're putting NATO all over the world in order to try and give it relevance and to save it. We should let it go.
David?
Yes, thank you, Colonel. The United States has frozen $7 billion of Afghanistan's assets. Last Friday, President Biden issued an executive order that would split those assets. $3.5 billion would go towards humanitarian aid for the Afghanistan people, the Afghan people, and $3.5 billion would go towards potential legal claims brought by American families who lost loved ones on September 11th. Should the people of Afghanistan be forced to pay restitution to the victims of 9/11?
That's a difficult question to answer. On the one hand, most of that money is probably U.S. taxpayer money, given all the corruption in Afghanistan. Read Sarah Che's book, Thieves of State, if you want to know how filthy Afghanistan was in terms of corruption. And most of the money that was wasted and lost there was U.S. taxpayer dollars. The second point I would make is that Biden has a political problem. His polls are slipping and so forth, and is grasping for things that might, put a little patina on his political problem that would be positive. I understand that. But I also understand the implication in your question that we're really putting the Afghan people in trouble here. The purpose, of course, is to put the Taliban government in trouble. And if you go back and check my remarks earlier, as Kabul fell, I said, I hope we react this way. And one of the thises was we give the Taliban all manner of assistance in attempting to run the country if they will be at least reasonable in that effort. And that means not returning to the past and keeping women out of schools and so forth and so on. And I had every reason to believe from my insight into the talks that the Taliban would be amenable to that, just to get the money and just to be able to run the country. So you're killing that also. You're being harsh. You're trying to bring them down. And you're trying to bring them down on the backs of the people who are basically innocent. So it's a mixed bag. I don't know what the right answer is. I probably wouldn't have done it.
Colonel, did the Taliban attack us?
How do you mean?
9/11. Were the Taliban behind 9/11?
No, but they were, Mullah Omar at least, it was untalkable out of his protection of Osama bin Laden. So in that respect, I understand why most Americans would probably not understand the distinction and would probably support punishing the Taliban. They're not very savory people either.
Well, on that point, we have to conclude. We've been talking with retired Colonel Larry Wilkerson, who teaches at William and Mary College in Virginia, who is very active in peace movements, arms control movements, enlightenment on foreign policy, drawing on his immense experience in the military and diplomatic departments of the U.S. government over the years, including being Chief of Staff to Secretary of State Colin Powell. Thank you very much, Larry. And before we leave, what's the best way for people to connect with you?
Oh, my William and Mary email is on William and Mary's website. It's Lima Bravo, LBWILK @WM.edu.
Thank you again, Larry. Thank you for your work and how you bring conscience to your work and connect it to experience. And you never give up. You represent the best of the retired military, in my judgment, and you're networking more and more of these veterans who have to start speaking up more and getting more members in all these groups like Veterans for Peace and others that you've mentioned today. To be continued. Thank you very much, Larry.
Thank you, Ralph, and thank you for all you've done, too.
We've been speaking with Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson. We'll link to his work at ralphnaderradiohour.com. Up next, we're going to talk about Harriett Tubman and the $20 bill. But first, let's check in with our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber.
From the National Press Building in Washington, D.C., this is your Corporate Crime Reporter Morning Minute for Friday, February 18, 2022. I'm Russell Mokhiber. The congressman who collected the most corporate campaign money last year is the chairman of the committee that writes the tax code, Congressman Richard Neal, Democrat of Massachusetts. In 2019, Neal received more than $1.4 million from PACs that represent corporations and business interests. That's according to a report from Sludge. As chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, Neal has more power than any other member of the House of Representatives to address corporate tax avoidance. But in his first year as committee chairman, Neal did nothing to bring any substantial legislation on corporate taxes before his committee for votes. Several of Neal's corporate political action committee donors are affiliated with profitable Fortune 500 companies that paid an effective tax rate of 0 or less in 2018. For the Corporate Crime Reporter, I'm Russell Mokhiber.
Thank you, Russell. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. I'm Steve Scrovan, along with David Feldman and Ralph. With our next guest, we're going to discuss the important historic symbolism in the debate over whose picture deserves to be on our most commonly used paper currency, the $20 bill. David?
Clarence Lusane is a professor and former chairman of Howard University's Department of Political Science. He's an activist, scholar, journalist, and author. His latest book is coming out in November, published by City Lights Books. It's called $20 and Change, Harriett Tubman versus Andrew Jackson and the Future of American Democracy. Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Professor Clarence Lusane.
Thank you, David. Thank you for having me.
Welcome indeed, Clarence. We're seeing a wonderful emergence of information in the schools around our country on Black history. I remember in my education, the only figure that we even mildly referred to was Frederick Douglass. And now you're researching and have written about the life of Harriet Tubman, who had an extraordinary career between sometime, I guess, 1840 and 1913, and is now being proposed during the Obama administration of having her visage on the $20 bill in place of Andrew Jackson. You know, there's a reason why Donald Trump admires Andrew Jackson, because he was a precursor of violating and challenging the laws of the land and destroying thousands of Cherokee natives and other bigoted actions during his area of power. And so the symbol was to replace him with Harriett Tubman. But before we talk about her remarkable career, I want you just to give our audience a little description of this remarkable book that you put out a few years ago called The Black History of the White House.
Yep. So thank you for mentioning that. So when Obama was running for president, I received a number of requests to write about Obama. And at the time, there were dozens of books coming out, including Obama had written about himself. But one of the things that struck me was that for many people in the country, white Americans, but other people as well, there was no real sense of history and what had been the experience of Black people in the White House, both from the staff side, but also from what happened before the Civil War. And so City Lights, which has a long and really honorable history of pulling together these experiences that other publishers often don't look at, said, fine, it would be great if I write a book about what happened before Obama in terms of the Black experience. And in the process of writing that book, I began to uncover these stories of Black people who had been in the White House, who had been enslaved, Black people who had escaped from the White House, the first African-American who was on the Secret Service, who was driven out by racism. So all of these untold narratives that give a fuller picture of what the White House actually is and how it's been a prism for race in the country makes up what I tried to do with that book.
Did you also indicate that Blacks helped build the White House?
And built the White House, and in fact, built Washington, D.C. when the country first formed in the late 1780s. Washington, D.C. did not exist. This was where I'm at right now, was a jungle, rocks and trees and boulders. And so it was projected correctly that it would take about 10 years to clear the area and build the essential constructions, including Congress, the Capitol, and the White House. And in that period, while George Washington initially wanted labor coming from Europe, that didn't happen. So just like every major construction that took place in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries in this country, in the 19th century, slave labor was employed. And Michelle Obama mentioned this at the 2000 and I believe 16 or 12 National Convention, and it created a bit of a stir because it was new information to most people. But absolutely, slave labor was critical in building the White House.
Thank you for that history. Let's turn to Harriet Tubman. What motivated her to do what she did in those critical years before the Civil War, during the Civil War, and after the Civil War? Can you give us a description?
So, Ralph, you're raising a question that often is not raised about Harriet Tubman, which is, what did she do after the Civil War? So she's best known for having escaped slavery herself in the 1840s. She just was a determined young woman and said she was not going to live all her life enslaved. But unlike many others, she came back and rescued other individuals, family members, and many people that she did not know. And as you can imagine, it was the most dangerous work possible, both in terms of just being on the road, and most of her efforts at helping people escape took place in the middle of winter. So just freezing to death, you can imagine. But of course, the real danger was that very quickly she became number one on the fugitive list for slave catchers. And she was never caught. And every single individual she went to get, she brought back safely. So those heroics became pretty well known right as the Civil War was breaking out in 1861. She transitioned from being someone who went to rescue people to working with the Union Army. She was a nurse, she was a spy, she was a scout. She was the first woman to lead a military raid. This was on the Combahee River, South Carolina, where she and the soldiers she led rescued 700 people who were enslaved. So all that happened during the war. Some is that she did not sit on her hands after 1865. She continued to be engaged. She was part of the suffrage movement. She went to not only the women's organizations that were led by some of the well-known white women, but also there were Black women who were engaged in the suffrage movement, but also around voting rights. Her last words, actually, before she died in 1913, as you mentioned, was to send encouragement to Black women who were participating in some of the suffrage efforts. So her entire life was one where she was dedicated to inclusion and what I argue in the book, democracy with a small d. And to me, it's always been important to link the struggle for racial justice with the struggle for expanding democracy. And Harriet Tubman embodied that nonstop.
She was such a woman of action. Did she actually write down some of her observations or her beliefs, what motivated her, like Frederick Douglass did in a number of books? Or was she just focusing on getting things done?
So she never fully learned to read and write, unlike Frederick Douglass. And so there's not a lot that she wrote, but she gave lots of interviews and she met with lots of journalists and researchers over her life. Now, much of what was said about her during her lifetime, in fact, were embellishments, not from her, but from others. There were rumors that there were, thousands of dollars offered for her, that, she helped 1,000 people escape. And these were exaggerations, none of which she needed. Her life in and of itself is just remarkable. But she did give interviews and she did address some of the issues I talked about in terms of voting and suffrage. She spent time in her later years building a home for seniors and for seniors who were poor. So, in every single way she could, she saw herself serving the community and doing what she could. And again, someone who never had any formal education, but, she knew more about the world than, many people who had plenty of education.
Well, she wasn't treated very well. She struggled to get her pay when she was employed by the Union Army during the Civil War. And afterwards, she tried to get her pay and she contacted members of Congress and she didn't get much of a pension. Can you talk about that? Because it really reflects the way the establishment treated her after all she did for the Union cause.
So that's exactly right. So she did not just volunteer for the Union Army, she was contracted by the Union Army. And again, she played a number of roles as a nurse, as a scout, as a spy, dangerous roles, risky roles, hard working roles. And when it was over, she later applied for a pension because the federal government was giving pensions to people who had been in the military. And she was denied. She fought for literally decades. Finally, she was able to get her husband's pension. She had remarried after the Civil War, and her husband had been a veteran. And when he passed, they finally were able to work it out. And that's where, one of the great ironies kind of emerges, is that her ultimate pension was $20 a month, which of course fits in with this movement now and the effort to put her on the $20 bill. At the time that Treasury Secretary Lew made the announcement, apparently he was unaware of that particular history, so he never mentioned that particular coincidence. But certainly that was a critical part of her life. And there have been efforts to still get a pension for her. Talk to her family members. The main problem with her getting a posthumous pension is that she did not have any direct heirs. She remarried, but she never had any children of her own. So there are plenty of relatives that she had brothers and sisters, but no direct descendants.
And what's the likelihood that she'll appear on the $20 bill after years of struggle?
Well, it should happen. The Trump administration, I believe, wanted to, but never officially killed the deal. There were other complications beyond Trump's own reluctance to do it. One is that it was required by law. There are security procedures that require that U.S. currency periodically be changed, often invisible to many people, but sometimes it's visible. For example, the image of the person may be larger than in the previous bill. But also the bills require, this was coming out of a Supreme Court case, they also have to be developed for the disabled. And so that requires some very special kind of development. So although when Secretary Lew made the announcement, there was sort of a hint that it would take a couple of years. And in fact, he had projected that it could happen by 2020, which would be the 100th year anniversary of the 19th Amendment. It actually really was not possible. And even if Trump wanted to do it, it was not going to happen during the Trump administration. So the projections now probably 2029, 2030 in that area. And I should also mention that other currencies will also have changes as well, including the $5 bill and the $10 bill, not on the front, but on the back. Now, there's still an effort to not just have Tubman on the face of the $20 bill, but to not have Jackson on the back of the $20 bill, because that's what's being projected now, that Jackson would not be removed. He would just be put on the back of the bill.
For people who want to know more about Harriet Tubman, what's the best book? And they may want to give it to their elementary and high school libraries.
Okay, so there are actually tons of books, both for young adults as well as works that are by scholars. Bound for Glory, I think that's the name of it, by Larson. It's one of the better books because it came out later. So it actually made a lot of corrections on work that had been done in the past and was able to get to some records that just were not available. One, for example, and this is the truth, there had always been a mystery about exactly when Harriet Tubman was born. And that was because for many people who were enslaved, of course, there was not always those records. But in research over the last few years, I actually discovered the day she was born, which was March 15th, 1822. So actually her 200th year anniversary is coming up. What's even more remarkable about that is that Andrew Jackson was born on March 15th.
What a coincidence. Clarence, can you give the title and author of that book once more?
Bound for the Promised Land by Kate Larson is really a great researched and well-written book about Harriet Tubman's life.
Very good. Steve, David, some comments?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I'm looking at a list of who's on our dollar bills, and there are a lot of slaveholders. There's George Washington, Jefferson, Madison. With the statues coming down, are we going to get to a point where we're going to start taking the slaveholders off our money?
Maybe. So again, I think that there are ranges. You're absolutely right. Even Benjamin Franklin, for example, at one point in his life had individuals who were enslaved to him, at least one. But I would draw somewhat of a distinction with Andrew Jackson. As Ralph mentioned, I think it was Ralph, not only did Jackson's, what he committed in terms of genocide, massacres relative to Native American people, and set the stage for the Trail of Tears, Jackson was also a slaveholder and a slave trader, and a brutal one at that. So when you look at his record, to me, it stands out far more so than some of the others. But 12 out of the first 16 presidents were slaveholders. Not something we're necessarily taught when we taught American history, but those are the facts. If you look at the Washington Post just last month, and they just updated it, did some research on slaveholders who have been in Congress, and it's over 1,700. So there's a long record of individuals, and given how the country evolved, who were slaveholders. And so I think it requires some measurement, and clearly all of these individuals are not going to be removed, but some, I believe, are more egregious and more deserve a more critical lens. And with Jackson, he's basically been ignored. There are statues of Jackson, there are buildings named after him, and that I think needs to be challenged. A lot has happened, as you mentioned, David, in the last few years. For example, around Woodrow Wilson.
$100,000 bill. I'm looking at a $100,000 bill right now. I'm seeing his face.
Well, again, Woodrow Wilson, he was president during World War I and attempted to create the League of Nations, and was president of Princeton. So he's kind of had those accolades, but he was also the person who reinstituted segregation in Washington, D.C. and in the U.S. government, and just had an atrocious record. And so you're starting to see changes relative to his honorifics. Here in Washington, D.C., for example, one of the prominent high schools was named after Woodrow Wilson. And just last year, they voted to change the name. And we saw at Princeton, for example, that they changed the name of at least one building that had been named after Woodrow Wilson. So I think that, there are times when there's a sense of recognition that the honors that were given to some of these individuals upon further examination should be drawn back.
Well, we've reached the end of our time. We've been speaking with Dr. Clarence Lusane, who's a professor and director of International Affairs Program at Howard University in Washington, D.C. Thank you very much, Clarence.
All right, thank you, guys. You guys have a great day.
We've been speaking with Professor Clarence Lusane. We will link to his work at ralphnaderradiohour.com. That's our show. I want to thank our guests again, Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson and Professor Clarence Lusane. For those of you listening on the radio, we're going to cut out right now. But for you podcast listeners, stay tuned for some bonus material we call the wrap-up. A transcript of the show will appear on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour website soon after the episode is posted, and it will be a blue link just above the audio player for those of you trying to search it out.
Subscribe to us on our Ralph Nader Radio Hour YouTube channel, and for Ralph's weekly column, you can get it for free by going to nader.org. For more from Russell Mokhiber, go to corporatecrimereporter.com. Join us next week on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. Thank you, Ralph.
Thank you, everybody, and be active.
Hey, this is Jimmy Lee Wirt, producer of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, and welcome to the wrap-up. First, Ralph talks with Lawrence Wilkerson about domestic politics, possible civic action, and media marginalization.
Well, given all the opposition of the Republican Party to anything defined as human well-being, they oppose all the social net proposals of Biden. They oppose the environmental. They deny climate disruption. They want more armaments instead of building infrastructure in all the communities throughout the United States, creating a lot of domestic jobs. They're warmongering. They want to give Wall Street power over Main Street. They represent everything negative about uplifting our country. Why do you think they're going to win in November in the House and Senate? Because the Democratic Party defaults? They don't know how to campaign?
I think the political alignment right now, I don't see how anyone can argue with them losing both houses of Congress in the midterms. And then the presidential election is anybody's guess, but I don't see anybody on the Democratic side who's got the capacity to coalesce the necessary support from his own party to get elected president. And even worse than that, I don't see the Republicans allowing it to happen. They learned a great deal from this last election where Trump lost. And they have passed laws in 20, 21 states or so now to make sure it doesn't happen again. And they're busy passing laws that are going to make sure that even if it should happen again, they can reverse it. It's really looking grim out there for the Democrats. But let me hastily add that I don't have a great deal of faith in the Democrats producing anyone where he or she even able to take the reins of power who would do much better.
Well, I mean, that comes down to whether you think Pelosi and Schumer are doing much better than Kevin McCarthy and Mitch McConnell.
Only photogenically. Yeah, let me give you an example. When we were working the Senate and the House to get legislation passed under the War Powers Resolution to essentially get the United States out of that brutal, horrible war in Yemen, we were successful only because we managed to get around Pelosi, Hoyer, Schumer, and other Democrats who didn't want to vote for the legislation. We tricked them literally into having to vote for the legislation, but they tricked us because they knew when we brought Republicans on board, like Mike Lee in the Senate, they knew that it was going to pass squeakily in both houses, and it did. And they knew that Trump was going to veto it. So then they could seem, once it had passed, that they were champions of the bill because they knew Trump was going to veto it. He did, and so our effort was stymied, and their desire to keep giving Saudi Arabia what it wanted was supported. That's more insidious even than a Republican standing up there like some dumb idiot and saying, we have to send the war instruments to Saudi Arabia. Pelosi, Hoyer, and Schumer.
Well, you know, you've been known to mobilize people in the civic community, retired military and diplomatic officials. You've gone on Capitol Hill. You've got prominent access to senators, representatives on arms control and dealing with the U.S. in Iraq and Afghanistan and Libya and Yemen. Tell us a little bit about this network and how is it increasing in influence?
Well, it's a whole bunch of networks now, and I'm not sure that any one of us has all that much clout anymore. But the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft is probably the most prominent one right now that I'm a non-resident fellow of. And their whole mantra, very powerful mantra, I think, and resonating with a lot of Americans too. I'd say probably 65 to 70% of Americans is restraint, just restraint, plain and simple, which translates into diplomacy rather than bombs, bullets, and bayonets. We're up against an enormous complex, as you and I were discussing at the opening of this interview, led by the defense contractors who love war or rumors of war because it's very profitable. And they're everywhere now. They're even down at William and Mary, as I indicated. They're all over my campus now. The other thing I'm associated with that I think has some promise, if we can just get some more states in, is something called American Promise. And it's a movement that started in Maine to get a constitutional amendment that essentially nullifies the Supreme Court decision, commonly known as Citizens United, and thus gets all this very polluting money out of our politics. Maine had a perfect example of what it's like this last time around. They had something, I forget the exact figures, but it was hundreds of millions of dollars poured into Maine, not a dollar of it from a Mainer, all of it from outside Maine, in order to beat one of their senators. And they couldn't believe how much money poured into their state and polluted their political process. So that movement sort of gestated out of that. 21 states have already passed legislation saying that if the Congress puts forth a constitutional amendment, they will entertain it and be positive towards it. We need to get more. We need to get about 39 or 40 states. But that's a very positive movement, too.
The media has not distinguished itself during this Ukraine controversy. And
not at all.
NPR seems to ask war-inciting questions rather than peace-inciting questions. You used to get on the mass media. You would get on Bill Maher. You get on the networks. Where are you now? Are you being marginalized from the mainstream media?
I would guess that there's a tendency not to want me there, because when we enter these periods where the media becomes cheerleaders for war, they don't want anybody who dissents. They don't want anybody who's trying to present the history, for example, and trying to present reasonable prospects of dialogue and so forth. They don't want that. They want their ratings to go up. The media is not the fourth estate anymore, unless you consider the fourth estate warmongers. They're right there with everyone else cheering on the war.
And now Steve asks a question of Professor Clarence Lusane.
This is slightly off topic, but it's more about Obama, and I just wonder if you have a comment on it. Personal anecdote, my daughter graduated from Oberlin College, which was one of the stops on the Underground Railroad,
Right.
famously. And she graduated about 7 years ago, 2015, toward the end of Obama's term. And Michelle Obama was one of the speakers. It was Marion Wright Edelman, but Michelle Obama opened for her. And she was mainly there to promote an initiative that was linking high school students with college students. But then she kind of went off, I don't know if she went off script or was just part, to kind of talk about her husband's legacy and time in office. And I was struck by something that she said about how we have to be satisfied with incremental change. And I guess talking about what her husband was up against in the political arena. A few weeks later, I hear Obama himself, he's on Mark Maron's podcast, and he says something very similar about incremental change. And I don't know if this is in light of Harriet Tubman or other civil rights leaders. The thought occurred to me that if the people who preceded them were content with incremental change, they might not have been in the positions they were in. Is that a fair statement?
So I think there are always options that presidents face, and all those options have risks. But if we look at how Lincoln, Roosevelt, how Johnson faced very challenging moments, they went bold. And all of these presidents have, flaws. There's no question about that. But the boldness that was demonstrated was essential in moving the country forward. And you can argue that there was opportunity, particularly when Obama came in with the financial crisis, that it opened up a door for a boldness that just seemed to be not where Obama wanted to take a risk. But I think absolutely, at least he had made an effort to reach really bigger than he did. I'm not that sure he would have failed, but I think he was cautious, and I think that had an impact on, ultimately what he achieved.
Finally, Ralph answers a listener question.
All right, let's do a listener question. David?
This comes to us from Larkin Chance. Supposedly representing the forces of good, the U.S. military spent $1 trillion over 20 years and left a country with a ruined infrastructure and a population on the verge of a famine. Why is Afghanistan being sanctioned? The Afghani people have served the U.S. by being a laboratory for drone technology and providing living targets described as suspected terrorists. To downplay or obscure a proper analysis of a 20-year conflict, the U.S. military has shifted gears to China and Ukraine. Over 4 executive administrations, the American people have had no say in the matter. This is not a democracy. I think we spent $14 trillion, Ralph, not $1 trillion.
Well, the point is well made, is that the brunt of our military maneuvers in Afghanistan have been taken by innocent Afghan civilians. Tens of thousands have perished, hundreds of thousands have been injured and sickened, and millions have been turned into refugees in areas of utter destitution. And we have the nerve to say that we can get out of Afghanistan and sanction the Taliban, whose only reason for victory is that the people hated the invader, the U.S., more than they feared or disliked the harsh Taliban. And so this is, again, just another chapter in the U.S. empire, which grows out of a oligarchy and plutocracy. The American people are never consulted. They are not even told about secret Pentagon budgets and other illegal uses of their money. And what do we expect to think that people in Vietnam and Korea and Yemen and Somalia and Iraq and Syria and Afghanistan are thinking about the U.S.? I think the only way to really get around this is to make the empire a major issue in all campaigns and to show the American people how it's devoured the U.S. itself by depriving our country of its priorities and its public budgets as we go around the world destroying areas that are filled with people who are not threatening us. So thank you for that question.
Ralph, just to follow up briefly, isn't that foreign policy view of part of the right-wing agenda. I mean, the so-called populist agenda is against these foreign wars, the Rand Pauls of the world and the Steve Bannons of the world. There's a little bit of an intersection there.
It's mostly rhetoric. The test of whether these people really mean to end empire is to go after the Pentagon budget, to go after the lack of any sanctions on the people who got us into these wars and are now reaping great lecture fees and book advances. People like Hillary Clinton, people like Donald Rumsfeld, and the people with George W. Bush, the people with the Obama administration, with the Clinton administration, they actually became better off. They were regaled, given awards, become very rich. And so unless you deal with the Pentagon budget and the war machine's commanders, the civilian commanders, from the White House to the State Department to the Defense Department, you're not going to get any changes. And we're at a low point now because there's almost nobody in Congress who's taken this empire on the way some of the predecessors did, like Senator Wayne Morris and Senator William Proxmire and others years ago. The Pentagon budget keeps growing without scrutiny. It's full of corruption and waste and redundancy, and it's a taboo. It's a taboo on Capitol Hill. There are no hearings on why we did what we did in Iraq. There are no congressional hearings on why we did what we did in Afghanistan. It's like the Congress is saying, here, President, you take it. And the presidents have, whether they're Democrats or Republicans. The imperial presidency continues under Joe Biden.
That's the real proof in the pudding. All of these people can talk a game, but unless they're going to do things like cut the budget or even have hearings on it, then yeah, what good is it? That's well-made point there. Thanks, Ralph.
And that's a wrap. Join us next week on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. Until next time.